Welcome to the Startup Grind.
Startup Grind is an event series, and it's a website designed to help educate, inspire, and connect local entrepreneurs in our community. So each month we welcome an amazing speaker who shares their story with our community and tells us what worked, what didn't work, and what they would do differently next time. This is powered by Google for Entrepreneurs. It's an amazing opportunity to learn from the best, network with other members of the startup community, and improve your chances for entrepreneurial success. So this month, we're featuring one of the biggest social innovation concepts and most successful startup founders in the triad, Shawn Gagne with Urban Offsets. Shawn has designed, and I think I'm correct in saying, the only carbon offset trading platform that unites the sustainability missions of corporations, higher ed, and municipalities. Is that a true statement, Shawn? Good. Urban Offsets is a graduate of the NC Idea Groundworks Lab in Durham and the Idea Lab program in Greensboro. They received a $50,000 NC Idea grant to help them with liftoff, and the company raised a $400,000 seed round led by Co-Founders Capital and David Gardner, who, by the way, is one of our past Startup Grind speakers. In 2016, they're in the process of closing in on a $2 million Series A round. So please give a big Winston-Salem welcome to Shawn Gagne and Urban Offsets. Good to see you, man. Thank you. So thanks for being here, Shawn. Before we get started...
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah. So before we get started, Shawn, we've had some interactions over the years, and Shawn, for those of you in the audience that are interested, is a really great coach. And my observation is that you've been more than willing to give back and talk to the startups in the community that need some advice and help. So Shawn's the real deal and has given the new ventures companies great advice as they're going through their experience of going from idea to repeatable revenue.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so enough flattery, right? So are you totally embarrassed yet? So it's good to see you, and we appreciate your role as a great coach and mentor to our startups. So I like to begin with how entrepreneurs kind of get started on their journey. And you told me, your field is environmental sciences, you told me about an epiphany you had while you were working in the Arctic in 2008. So tell us that story.
That's right. To get up to that story, I worked for 5 years before 2008 as an environmental consultant, mostly in Florida, working with cities, helping them with trees and wetland mitigation banks, and the precursor to carbon markets. But in 2008, in the summer, I was in the Northwest Territories in Canada, running my master's thesis on hydroecology. Yes, I know. And I remember writing my notes one day, sitting on the tundra, and realizing that I'm in the wrong place to study climate change and to affect any real impact. And at that point in time, it came to me that nobody cares about the polar bears because they don't see them every day. And that's a real problem for this on a motivational point of view. Yeah, especially when you come to voluntary markets. Like, what's voluntarily going to move these people forward is going to be things that they see every day. So it was at that point in time, Peter, where I realized I had to move climate science and markets into cities so we could create the biggest impact.
So you had that epiphany, and the idea of taking to where people live, and specifically urban areas, kind of got you started down the path and figuring out the metrics. So you kind of started with, how do I actually quantify and create the metrics required to create the backbone for a trading platform, right? So tell us a little bit about the early science behind what is enabled.
Oh, it was painful.
Yeah, right.
And It still kind of is, because the carbon market itself is a really obtuse thing. It's intangible. You don't really see what's going on, and yet there's these rules called protocols put together on how to create carbon offsets, and none of them work in an urban setting. We tried to use the ones from California in Greensboro, 2014, and they were awful. In fact, they have yet to produce a single carbon offset. So we had to, serendipitously, we actually met with Duke University Carbon Offset Initiative, and they were creating their own protocol, so a new set of rules on how to measure the carbon sequestration of a tree. And at this point in time, it's really important to know that a carbon credit, the thing that actually trades between companies, is really representing 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide that's absorbed or removed from the air. So however we know how to measure that, whether it's in soils or trees or capping methane gas, once we know how to do that, we can create projects that create it, measure it, and then you move it to market. But nobody knows how an urban tree grows yet today. All the models on urban forestry are based on rural trees. So the idea that a maple tree here in the middle of Winston-Salem is going to grow the same as if it was in a field is completely wrong. So we had to invent a system that allowed us to grow with the science and develop the science, and that's what the Duke protocol does. So we developed that, put it into play, and a lot of 10,000 trees got put in the ground across 12 cities in 2017.
So the backbone of this whole thing is being able to supply the metrics and validate the actual sequestration. And then you figured out how to monetize that, right, with the higher ed and the municipal market. So give us kind of a quick explanation of how that works. Why is there value in that? And how do you connect that value to somebody that's willing to pay for it?
I think that was what you're just describing as the crux of our business opportunity,
right,
and how we pivoted middle of last year. So value is a very perception-driven thing. And when you have a voluntary market, and when you mention higher ed, there's 700 schools across the country that have voluntarily decided to go carbon neutral sometime this century, okay? Why are they doing this? It's for thought leadership. They, that's one of the big things, getting ahead of things, show themselves at the tip of the spear sort of thing. But, so they have some money, they put it together. A great example is Duke University. They will be carbon neutral as of 2024. They declared it, now they've got to find out a way to do it. So one of the problems with that is, how do you find a suitable product, right? I don't know if you guys are aware, but Virgin Atlantic just had to pull back from a carbon offset project a couple weeks ago because it was perceived to actually cause damage to the indigenous cultures that it was supposed to serve. That's a perceptual issue. So how do you create a product that is going to stand up to the test of times? And the answer is in de-risking things. So earlier in 2017, we came to the realization that when a voluntary buyer like a university or Delta Airlines, who we just had a big announcement with yesterday, or Etsy or Burton or any of the other voluntary customers that we have, when they buy something, they're not actually, they're buying the offset itself, so that metric ton, sure, because that's what's going to help them reach their goals. But 90% of what they're buying, based on our research, is actually the perception of the product, because it has to serve their bottom line, their marketplace, their philanthropy, their employee engagement. So the better we're able to align that product with what they need, the better able we are to de-risk it, which means that they're going to buy it and buy more of it, which means that we can provide more of it.
So you just signed, I'm a little off script here, you just signed this big contract with Delta Airlines. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that came about?
This is a pretty huge thing for us. So Delta Airlines has been voluntarily buying carbon offsets since 2013. They spent $8 million on it. Okay, nobody knows because it's not attached to a lot of their marketing stuff. So I went to Delta Airlines and I said, there's a couple things we can do for you. One of them is every offset you source, we can impact a community where you serve. So they fly out of Raleigh-Durham Airport. We can then take a portion of every dollar that's used to purchase an offset to support Keep Durham Beautiful's efforts to reforest underserved communities, okay? That's number one, so we can tie everything to a geography that matters. The second one is, and this is a huge opportunity actually, is something called scope overlap or emissions overlap. Every time a Duke University professor flies on Delta, the emission is counted twice. Duke University counts it and Delta Airlines counts it. And that happens with every airline and every business customer that flies right now. Why should Duke University and Delta Airlines spend money to solve the same thing? Okay, so what we did is Delta Airlines, they want university students flying on their planes. So by purchasing these offsets and supporting Raleigh-Durham communities, they can now offer carbon-neutral flights to Duke University, okay? And by taking those flights, both Delta and Duke win, and they reach their goals.
So they're getting the offsets. The local communities are getting the trees and being able to afford the urban forestry programs that come along with that.
Right.
So it's just a great kind of triple bottom line win for everybody involved on the platform.
I agree. It's pretty exciting because this stuff repeats annually, right? And one of the things the cities don't do because they can't is support a tree once it's in the ground. Everybody likes to plant a tree because that's a great picture opportunity, but nobody likes to take care of it for 40 years. And if you don't take care of it, you've got liability.
Right.
Right? And so this is a way to solve that too.
So let's get into some of the details of your journey. You've taken advantage of a lot of the programs here in the marketplace, right? So I think you started at Idea Lab over in Greensboro, or Launch Lab, I guess it was called, and then moved on to Groundworks Lab and got involved with NC Idea. So tell us a little bit about those programs and how they helped advance the ball along the way, because a lot of the folks in our community are potential candidates to go into those programs, so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was really an important decision. I remember talking to my wife in 2014. I started with Groundwork Labs, but I remember talking to my wife in 2014 saying, I don't know what's going to come out of this, but I need to try it. Because at that point in time, I was 4 years into my first company, Talking to Trees, a company that just helps cities manage urban forestry resources, right? And I was I didn't know where to go next. It was a poorly monetized product, even though we had adoption in 5 countries, right? So I didn't know how to get to that next step. So 3 days a week, I went to Groundwork Labs in the Tobacco campus in Durham, and I learned everything that I didn't know. And it was at that point in time where I started realizing that sales is your research and development arm. Right, every customer, every prospect you approach provides you with a learning opportunity that gets you closer to a product that solves the problem. And as long as you're married to the problem and solving the problem, then you can avoid the traps that usually kill a startup. So we went through that 2014. That prepared us for the NC Idea competition in the spring of 2015, which we won. I actually had a kidney stone in the middle of that prep time. That was insane. But we won. We're still the only green company, I believe, to win that business competition, which is a real big honor. And it was at that point we realized that venture capitalists see a business in this, which was a big traction point for me, that this isn't just living in my head, that there is a business here, so let's continue to develop it. But I didn't want to move to Durham. I wanted to stay in Greensboro because that's where we had settled with our family. And the triad's really important for us to grow an ecosystem. You have to give back to the ecosystem. So at that point in time, in the summer of 2015, I joined Launch Lab, right? And since then, annually, I mentor and support the startups that go through there.
Right. So you just kind of touched on one of what I think the real nuggets are tonight in terms of valuable information, is the concept that the sales process is an R&D process. And I want to dwell on that a little bit because it's one of the key learnings that I think we can get out of tonight. So tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, that starts with listening, right?
Oh my goodness, yes. It also starts with the understanding that you don't know things.
Right.
Like a lot of the problem comes from the fact that, how many times have you heard somebody, if the customer just doesn't get it, they just don't understand that, if they only understood what I'm doing, then it would be perfect. But you got to flip that because you're not understanding what the customer's pain points actually are. So that's where the value proposition stuff comes in.
And real quickly, you told me an example of that was a call you were on with Goldman Sachs, right? So
Yeah.
tell us that story.
Oh, I don't remember that one, but I do remember the one with Volvo.
Okay, tell us the one with Volvo.
That was actually one of the darkest moments of the startup, but now I look back at it with humor and say, oh, that was such a learning experience. We thought we knew what was going on. It was after the NC Idea competition. We thought we had the answers. So we actually successfully secured a meeting with a high up in Volvo Group to talk about sustainability. And it couldn't have been the worst day ever. The person who we met with just came back from lobbying against stricter environmental standards, and so she's talking about this as she comes in the room. And I'm like, oh man, what are we doing here? And it was at that point. So I had David Gardner on the phone listening in, and he
was listening
Yes.
into this client conversation.
and he wasn't
okay,
and
great.
he wasn't an investor yet.
Right.
So
Oh,
this is
good.
at the beginning of it. So it was myself and two co-founders in the room, and then two people from Volvo. And I went through my pitch. I was robotic in slide after slide after slide, and then I got called out. Essentially she called BS on me. And my response at that point in time was just forget about the slides and have a conversation. And I didn't. I walked out of there with my head, hanging. Let's call it level, but no customer. But from that point in time, we were able to identify what we were doing wrong, how to move to a better product, and how to learn from that. Like, it didn't kill us; it made us stronger. But it's a very hard thing to get through, I guess.
Right. So, Co-Founders Capital, this is a little off script again a little bit, so just bear with me. Co-Founders Capital has a great reputation and has a great success rate with the startups that they invest in. So tell us a little bit about that experience. I think that's been really forward-leaning for you, and you've gotten a lot of value out of that interaction with that investor. So why has that proven to be so valuable to you?
So they always say that the key asset to an investor is the knowledge base that they bring, not the money. Let's call it, dated David Gardner for 18 months before he signed a deal. Okay, and in those 18 months, he learned what our business was. He saw our failings. He saw me, pick myself up and move and adapt and continually adapt and continue to move forward and try new things. So it was those data points that really mattered. So many people don't want a relationship with an investor. I'm not that person. I want to know who's going to be sitting on my board, who I'm going to be calling weekly, sometimes when the chips are down. So with David Gardner and Tim McLaughlin, who is our advocate, I want to say, sits in on our board meetings and everything. They really understand our business, but they understand it from an investor's point of view, and then can translate that outward. So we're the only non-SaaS company in David Gardner's portfolio. We're also the only company not in the triangle. So there's a lot of individual specifics that to Urban Offsets that he doesn't have with his other companies.
So you get a lot of attention.
We get a lot of attention, good and bad.
That's good.
But I'll be honest with you. David knows how to talk to investors. He also has a great network to call you on your bullshit and tell you what you need to do next. And it's that sort of hard stuff that you need to hear when you move forward.
Okay. So back on script, tell us a little bit about your competitors. So, there aren't a ton of urban offset platforms out there, but what are your potential competitors in the marketplace? Who do you go up against?
It's interesting to be on the bleeding edge of something. Sounds exciting, but it's often tough. So the way I describe our marketplace and where we are in the competitive landscape, for people of a certain age, my age and older, we remember buying airline tickets by calling a travel agent. And you would call that travel agent, you tell them where you want to fly, and then they are the gatekeepers to all the information, and then they give you options, you choose an option, and you go along your way. That's the way the carbon market operates today. There's a lot of hidden information from the buyer. So what we're doing is we're essentially like the Travelocity of the carbon marketplace, where we provide all of the information so people can make the decisions and de-risk it the way they want to. Our competitors right now, there aren't a lot. There are dozens of carbon brokers operating in the marketplace who transact carbon offsets, but I really think that Concur, the business expense platform, is going to be our major competitor in the business-to-business carbon neutral space.
Interesting. Yeah, so I actually deal with those brokers because we do lead certification on building projects, and frequently we're in the business of buying carbon offsets to...
Why aren't you buying them from me?
I will. I will. I need to get another project. So let's talk about your team. And I've seen you in operation and seen your team members, and they're really focused. They're really passionate about what they're doing. So what's your magic there? I mean, how have you been able to build this team and pick the right people?
Serendipity. That's not the answer you want. It's first of all, I surrounded myself with two co-founders who had a lot of startup experience. Okay, they didn't have. So I was the unique position of having the environmental science background. So that was the strength I had. There were some other strengths that I developed over the last couple of years. But in order to find the people in your team who are going to actually help you succeed, you have to know what your strengths are. If you don't know what your strengths are, then you're just going to start duplicating what your strengths are, which causes conflict, which drags you down. So co-founders, very strong co-founders who have a wide breadth of skills, technology, finance, just general advice. Like there's so many things that you come across that you don't, aren't pigeonholed in an operational or sales point of view.
Right.
But then we have this amazing business developer who understands that it's about relationships. And relationships are not marketing and not just sales, but it's about understanding what the business is, being able to ask the questions to get you the information, and operating, I want to say semi-autonomously, right?
Right.
I can't be spending my time micromanaging the team, but I also have to feel comfortable that my message is being replicated by the team. And so that's a difficult thing to do, especially when your message changes quite often, because every new piece of information from a customer kind of, tweaks your messaging a little bit. Did this work? Did this not work? What are we saying next? How does that affect our platform? So you've got to have flexible people, and we've made mistakes. I mean, we've had to let people go very quickly, but knowing what we need allows us to make that decision.
So, so once you get the team in place, startups learn that actually executing is really difficult. And the startups that we've worked with, you can tell which ones are kind of moving forward and advancing the ball because they can tell you what their performance metrics are. So tell us a little bit about how you keep everybody focused and moving the business forward, and what kind of metrics you put in place to make sure that everybody's achieving what they need to be achieving.
Yeah, that's interesting. An investor I talked to recently from the West Coast just told me nobody cares about your intellectual property. All that we care about is your execution and your ability to execute. So those proof points are in your contracts and what you're doing. So I think execution is really important. I'm a believer in, so we don't have set KPIs, okay, which is important. We have sales goals, right? But we don't know if it's going to be a huge sale for one quarter that's going to get us everywhere, or a bunch of small ones. We know who we're approaching. We know who we're not talking to. We know how we're talking to things, and we know who we're talking to within the organization. Those things are important. That number one. Number two, leveraging your past successes will help you understand what your KPIs need to be. So getting Duke University got us Arizona State. Arizona State got us American University, got us Pace, got us Green Mountain, got us, all these other ones. That stuff is important to us. But for me, and this might not be a satisfactory answer for a lot of startups, our customers do a lot of our sales for us. So Duke University wants other people to know what they're doing, so they talk to other people. The same thing is true for Delta Airlines or Etsy. I'm flying up to New York later this week to talk to Airbnb and some other prospects. And I think it's really important to know that they don't see us as generating a number, but generating an experience and allowing them to solve their own problem. So maybe just to keep it simple, we have to understand what our customers' KPIs are and then deliver on those.
Got it. So you have some great blog posts on your website. And
Thanks.
one that I particularly like, and this may sound a little bit strange, is you wrote a blog post about fear and the role that fear can play as a positive force for a startup and also as a very negative and destructive force for a startup. So it is scary to go down this path,
Oh my
right?
goodness.
I mean, there are moments of sheer terror that I'm sure a lot of the folks in the audience that are startups have experienced, right? So can you expand on that a little bit? Because I think
briefly.
that's another great, piece of knowledge that
Yeah.
you can bring.
I
to
think
the
if
table.
people knew what kind of fear troughs you're going to run into as an entrepreneur ahead of time, they wouldn't do it. But it's absolutely necessary, and that's what develops the grit. So fear of failure is a big thing. What happens if you succeed as well? I read a lot about what happens when an entrepreneur succeeds and the down that can create. But what drives us forward is the fear of missing out. What is the world going to look like without our solution in place? And that's not. I want to be very cautious. That's not big-headed. What that is confidence in what you're doing. And if we don't do it, then what's that going to result in?
Right. So just a little plug for you. It's worth checking out Shawn's blog posts. I find them to be very instructive.
Thanks.
So you've really charted a steady path with fundraising. We've talked about Co-Founders Capital. Tell us a little bit about how you've been successful. I mean, you've really moved through the fundraising process pretty smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
As an outside observer. I'm sure it's been a hell of a lot of hard work. But tell us why you've been successful going from the $50,000 to the $400,000 seed round, and now you're closing in on a $2 million Series A.
Everything comes down to proof points and execution. We are able to execute our vision. So in other words, I'm in the unique position of being able to take the vision out of my head, communicate it to a team, communicate it to customers, work diligently towards making that happen, not sweating the small stuff, and then getting it to a point where our customers tell our story for us. So all of those things coalesce into something an investor cares about, which can help us get to the next step.
So sidebar question on that, have you used customer testimonials to your
Yes,
advantage
absolutely.
in fundraising?
Oh, so I want to be clear about this. We are definitely not using them in that way.
Right.
We collect testimonials because it's part of the research that we collect. Right. How are they talking about us? But I will, send things off to investors. Absolutely.
I
saying,
see that, right.
In fact, one of the investors we're in diligence with right now, I actually set him up to interview one of my customers. And so my customer at Arizona State said, "Yeah, we'd be happy to talk to your investor and see how that goes." I mean, that's might sound crazy, but it worked out.
Okay. So I think we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'll just pass the mic around, hold it up close so we capture your question.
Great concept.
Thank you.
Can you give us an order of magnitude for what it takes to offset a metric ton of carbon dioxide? As an example, let's take this building that we can see across the street. Let's take the Wells Fargo building. How many trees are we truly talking about from just an order of magnitude?
Right. That's an excellent question. I don't know I don't want to speak for that building, but I can speak for what Delta and Duke were doing. So with the project that was just announced on Monday, 5,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide, so that's 5,000 carbon offsets, will make, I think it's 9,000 round trips from coast to coast carbon neutral. So that's not insignificant. If you look at you step it up a little bit, Duke University emits about 90,000 tons of carbon a year by flying and driving and all that stuff. So what that comes down to is maybe 1,000 to 2,000 trees planted and maintained every year. Completely doable with what urban forest is.
90,000 to how many trees?
Anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 trees. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Don Gerhardt. I'm with Organic Transit and the ELF vehicle that's in the lobby. We're interested in potential of using that solar-powered ELF vehicle with carbon offsets. I don't know very much about carbon offsets, but do you see a potential for that type of
Absolutely, I
vehicle?
see a potential. I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards too. Well, we're doing a lot of stuff with blending carbon offsets with community solar programs, for example, to provide a whole sustainability portfolio option for universities and corporations. So, yeah, there's potential there, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess really any alternative transportation strategy that, in terms of pedestrian pathways and urban transit systems that, that reduce the per person carbon footprint. If you can measure it, there's a market for it, right?
Yes, that's right.
So I just wanted to make sure I understood the concept and where you're not, a place where you're not. You don't have to be. And that is, if I understand how science works with carbon dioxide and oxygen, that exchange between trees and man and their carbon dioxide, then I don't have to worry about whether or not I believe in climate change or not. I don't have to enter that politics of the debate.
Climate change is not a faith-based system. So it
I
doesn't,
don't have to. You don't even have to go there, right?
you don't have to, no, not at all.
If you understand the science of that exchange between those two.
I think a lot of it comes down to, especially on the voluntary side. I just had a talk with university PhD student at Copenhagen earlier today about this. It's the science on the doesn't even come into play for the voluntary market, because it's all about market pressures. Our customers say we need this. We understand it. That's one thing. The other thing is you get these companies like logistic companies, right? If you have UPS driving along and doing business in New York City, and then New York City is hit with a typhoon or a hurricane or something, that's going to knock out and cost them business. So if there's certain areas that flood more than others, and that's where they have their logistics hubs, well, there's a risk there for them. There's a business risk. That's called physical climate risk, and it's a $380 billion marketplace right now with no solution in place. It has nothing to do with the belief of climate change. It has to do with understanding how do we continue to do business and grow grow the global economy in a changing climate. Okay, how do we do shipping differently? How do we do logistics? How do we train our students properly? How do we reduce the risk of lending to cities? Things like that.
So like talking about drones, for example, if UPS would deliver their packages by drone and reduce their carbon emissions from their trucks, well, that's what you're talking about, right?
That's I think one of the reasons behind UPS buying all of those Tesla trucks.
So, what about so? Which side of your market are you seeing? Are you having the least amount of demand for? Are you having a harder time finding buyers, or are you having a harder time finding trees to grow to make the carbon credits?
One of the things we've really developed was the operational side of the supply. Okay, how do we? So at first we were working with cities, right, and then we decided just to work with nonprofits. Nonprofits are a lot easier to work, like the New York Restoration Project or Keep Greensboro Beautiful, but there's still this supply side problem of planting enough trees. Okay, so in a big city like New York, we're up to 15,000 trees planted. Okay, and so that's a good amount for us. In Greensboro, it's hard to find anything more than a couple hundred at a time. And a lot of it comes down to municipal restrictions. Where are these trees going to go? Who's going to take care of them? Things like that. So that takes up a lot of our time, but it's important to get right, especially as more and more cities start developing their own carbon neutrality plans and goals.
So, as a follow-up, is it just within the cities that you're planting trees, or are you tapping rural areas as well?
We focus on urban areas primarily because it's the area where most people live, where most of these effects are going to be elevated. But it doesn't mean we can't work in a rural area. What it comes down to is the attachment of the supply to a buyer. And as long as there's an attachment there, then we can at least go through diligence with it.
Appreciate it.
Hey, so you talked a little bit about competition, but I want to touch on broader risk. Generally, what types of risks do you see to your business model? And then more specifically, do you see increased demand for carbon offsets through the renewable energy portfolio standards increasing? Is that a big risk that you're looking at?
So when you say risk, I immediately go to the risk profile of a carbon offset. But you're asking risk to our business model, and what that comes down to is lower demand for carbon offsets. If, I don't know, if there was a world war, nobody cares about carbon at that point, right? But on the positive side, what we have here is, number one, the United States is the only country in the world not to sign Paris, okay? Which means that all trading, or a lot of trading with these countries, these Paris countries, are going to include a tariff. Okay, the industries that don't want that tariff are the ones who are developing their own regulation mechanisms, like the United Nations CORSIA for airlines. Okay, they want to supersede that. That is a huge demand for carbon offsets because most of, I think it's over 90% of the emissions from an airliner are from fuel. Okay, so you've got biofuel and you've got offsets. Right now, we're in this upswing where offset prices are starting to slowly creep up, and we're finding speculation in the offset marketplace to buy up our offsets to raise the price for when people start needing them in 2020. It's a difficult thing to manage, but just to finish off, one of the things that excites me about what we're doing is every tree that gets supported by a carbon offset is growing its own carbon offsets that we do not sell. So the more trees we get in the ground, the more carbon offsets, urban offsets is able to put into our own inventory to then give back to our customers when the time is needed.
I've traveled a number of times to Southeast Asia, okay, and the carbon emissions there are horrendous. Would that not be a huge market for you?
It would be a huge market for any of us. There's no reason why we remain contained to the United States. Okay, trust is one of the biggest things governing our marketplace. Without trust, there's nothing. And anyone can Google, offsets gone bad, and you can get multiple case studies on that. So one of the things is understanding the marketplace from a regulation point of view. Where there's a carbon tax in place, that's not helpful for our business because it commoditizes everything. It doesn't matter at that point. When it comes to a geographic carbon trading platform like what China has, for example, or is implementing, or California, then again we run into the commoditization aspect of it. But in the voluntary space and in the industrial space, China Airways is going to participate in CORSIA scheme, which means they are going to have to retain carbon neutrality for their growth, regardless of what the nation does itself.
So this is going to be really dorky. One of my favorite quotes on the subject of government and economics is by Charles Murray. He's kind of controversial. But he says that the problem, or the trick is to find that behavior, or to figure out how to motivate that behavior so that you're not engineering a solution. The trick is to strip away impediments to naturally occurring behavior rather than engineering a solution, because when you engineer a solution, that is going to naturally cause people to bristle and push back and fight it and do everything they can to get around that engineered solution.
Mm-hmm. I agree completely. And one of the big problems that we've uncovered in the last 6 months is the hidden and latent demand in the marketplace for our product. Okay, and value proposition design, going through the startup accelerators, helped us identify that. It's uncovering the actual problem and then seeing if the existing product solved that problem. It doesn't. So then you use your research and your sales to figure out, a hierarchy of needs to solve for your customer, and then we just hit those off and execute on every one of them. So we're actually solving the customer's problem, not creating a solution for something that doesn't exist. We're not making a better offset. We're just making the offset marketplace work for the people who want to buy it. And I think that's what matters.
So that's it for tonight. Let's give a big hand for Shawn Gagne and Urban Offsets.
Thank you. Thank you.